Good afternoon. I am Gloria Watkins, Project Officer and Drafter of the Fiscal Year 2024 Basic Center Program Notice of Funding Opportunity. Thank you for joining today's pre-application webinar, which is the fourth in a series of 5 presented by the Division of Runaway and Homeless Youth. Next slide. The goals of the webinar. The goals are to orient potential applicants to the new fiscal 24 Notice of Funding Opportunity, also known as the NOFO, to provide an overview of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Basic Center program, to address eligibility requirements, the application process, and associated timelines in submitting your application, and lastly, to respond to questions that were submitted in advance of today's webinar. Next slide. So who is eligible for Basic Center program funding? Public and nonprofit organizations are eligible unless they are part of the juvenile justice system. Also eligible are private institutions of higher education, but they must be nonprofit entities. Who is not eligible? For-profit organizations and individuals, including sole proprietorships and foreign entities. Next slide. The application submission and review process. So your application must be submitted via grants.gov by the designated date and time specified in the NOFO. Your application is limited to 2 uploaded files. The required standard forms, as detailed on page 37 of the NOFO, include your standard form 424, disclosure of lobbying activities, key contacts, lobbying form, and project performance site location. Please note that these forms do not count against the 2-file upload. Your application will be screened for eligibility to make sure it meets basic requirements. A merit review will also be conducted of all applications that are deemed eligible using the stated criteria, which corresponds to the program description and project narrative. It should further be noted that merit review results are not the only factor considered in making funding decisions. For those applications that are awarded, you should expect to receive notification by late summer of 2024. And for those who are not awarded or selected for funding, you should anticipate to receive notification near or at the beginning of October. Next slide, please. About the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So the NOFO includes 4 components. They are program description, and it addresses what the project should look like. It's where we provide details about the important program components and requirements. It also includes the project narrative, which speaks to how the project will be implemented. There are directions that explain how you will meet the purpose of the funding opportunity as described in the program description section. We also have the merit review component, and this is how your application will be evaluated. These are the factors that we will use to evaluate your application against the requirements in the program description and project narrative. Within the NOFO, there are hyperlinks that are provided which address other important items, and they include reporting, national program and administrative requirements if you are awarded funding, and key definitions that you will see throughout the NOFO. Next slide, please. The goal of the Basic Center program. The goal of the program is to establish and strengthen community-based projects that meet the immediate needs of youth who have left home due to family conflict or other crises, and youth experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So project requirements, again, what does it look like? Next slide. So the purpose of the program is that BCP funds programs that provide temporary emergency shelter and counseling service to young people less than 18 years of age. Our funding is provided to the community-based organizations to operate short-term shelters, which could include group homes and family host homes, and to provide counseling services to youth who have run away or are experiencing homelessness or housing instability, and who are already receiving services from the child welfare or juvenile justice systems. Excuse me, they are not already receiving services from the child welfare or juvenile justice system. BCP projects receiving funding, they must meet the following requirements. They must provide shelter and counseling services. They must incorporate a comprehensive youth-centered service model. They must ensure equitable treatment of all youth receiving services. They must have an outreach implementation strategy. They must conduct screening and assessment. They must provide case management. They must implement aftercare services, optional services if they opt to implement optional services. They must incorporate performance standards and also training and technical assistance. Next slide, please. So we're going to address shelter and counseling. Projects must provide youth under the age of 18 with both of the following services. They must provide temporary emergency shelter for up to 21 days and individual, family, and group counseling as appropriate. Some general requirements attached to shelter and counseling include: if a youth needs to stay in your shelter longer than 21 days, as a program, you can provide that shelter, but you cannot use our funds to support. If a young person needs transportation to your shelter, it is available and easily accessible. Your services must be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the lowest possible barriers to access, and you must have a publicly available shelter telephone number that is answered by staff 24 hours a day. You must also contact parents or legal guardians or relatives of a young person as soon as feasible or when safe to do so, but it cannot be later than 72 hours after the youth enters your program. Next slide. Your shelter must be licensed as a youth serving facility, and any shelter that you refer the young people that you serve must also be licensed when such a license is required by the state or local law. You cannot use our funds for respite care, and respite care is essentially when a parent or a legal guardian comes in and wants your program to provide temporary relief for providing services. This is not allowable with our funding. A parent or legal guardian, again, cannot bring a youth to shelter requesting services, and if a youth is forced to leave home or has no safe alternative place to live, they are considered homeless and eligible for shelter funded by your program. Your program must be in an area where youth under the age of 18 who have run away and who are experiencing homelessness can easily access your services. This includes rural or tribal communities or areas outside of the metropolitan area. It is essential that when you are supporting and serving these youth, that when they transition out of your shelter, that they go somewhere that is both safe and appropriate. Next slide, please. It is required that Basic Center program facilities adhere to the guidance as provided in RHY regulation at 45 CFR 1351.18 subpart C, which states facilities of your BCP project must have a minimum residential capacity of 4 and a maximum residential capacity of 20 individuals in a single structure. The only exceptions to this is when local laws or regulations require a higher maximum to comply with licensure requirements for child and youth serving families, and or if the facility is located within a single floor of a structure, in the case of apartment buildings, in which the floor to the structure where services are being provided must have a minimum residential capacity of 4 and maximum residential capacity of 20 individuals. Next slide. You may shelter a young person over the age of 18 years of age if there is a state or local law, including regulations, which allows for a higher maximum age in compliance with licensure requirements for child and youth serving facilities. If you provide shelter to a youth 18 years or older in the same facility as a youth 17 or younger, your shelter must have separate sleeping rooms for the two age group. You must also have a clear and detailed plan in place to ensure that minors are safe and secure when using bathrooms and showers, participating in shelter programming such as counseling or life skills group, and participating in recreational activities. You must also maintain safety protocols, procedures, and policies to ensure the safety and security of youth under the age of 17. If your program or shelter utilizes a host family home model, you are exempt from the minimum number of 4 youth per structure requirement. However, you are required to shelter at least 4 youth across multiple homes. Next slide. You must coordinate your shelter and services with the following entities. It includes law enforcement, healthcare and behavioral health services, including substance abuse and mental health, social services, the school system, and welfare personnel. You cannot use Basic Center program funds to pay the shelter costs of youth in the custody of child welfare, foster care, or juvenile justice. If you provide shelter to youth from any of these systems, you need a memorandum of understanding between your program and those systems to clarify or outline who is responsible for paying shelter costs and services when a youth enters the program. You must also develop a plan to work directly with foster care and correctional agencies to return youth who have run away from the custody of those systems. Your plan must include processes for returning youth to the correctional facility they ran from. Next slide. Please note that you can only provide prevention services if you plan to include optional home-based services as part of your program. And we'll talk a bit more about optional services as we move forward in the webinar. These funds cannot otherwise be used for prevention. Your staff must be trained and ready to provide services to youth who have left home without permission, who are experiencing homelessness or are living on the street, maybe those youth who may be in crisis or are experiencing or at risk of experiencing human trafficking, such as sex or labor trafficking, possible victimization, such as sexual assault, abuse, or physical abuse. And your staff must identify shelter services and other referrals for trafficked youth. Your shelters must also be safe, inclusive, and accessible for all youth, including youth of color, youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and are questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, LGBTQIA, 2S+, and other underserved populations. Next slide. When providing services, you must have a trauma-informed approach, and this comes under the Comprehensive Youth-Centered Service Model. Within your NOFO is a link that's embedded, which speaks to the effects of trauma and using a trauma-informed approach. You must also utilize a positive youth development framework, which is a framework that's intentional, which is a framework that is an intentional pro-social approach to engaging youth. Projects are expected to consult with and engage young people with lived experience of homelessness and offer them opportunities to have input on program implementation. We encourage that when you are engaging these young people and they are providing input as a result of their lived experience, that you compensate them for the work they are doing in your programs. And you may utilize Basic Center program funds to do that. To learn more about PYD framework, again, there is a link that is embedded into the NOFO. Next slide, please. Ensuring equity. To ensure equitable treatment of all the youth you serve, you must have a plan to provide safe, inclusive, and culturally responsive spaces and services for youth, including youth facing disabilities, youth of color, youth who identify as LGBTQIA2S+, and youth from other underserved populations. Also, be certain that your projects or programs are inclusive of the language access needs of youth and their families. Next slide. Outreach implementation strategy. Your program strategy must include direct outreach. And this is when your project goes and targets the population and seeks out young people to provide information about the services you offer and the benefit of those services. Your strategy must also include education and awareness. And that's where you are informing the community about your program, developing and distributing materials about your services and benefits. And these materials could include social media posts and public service announcement. You can also raise awareness of your programs by working with other family and youth serving organizations, law enforcement, healthcare providers, legal services, and other stakeholders. Your strategy must also include coordination. So you must coordinate with the National Communication System, also known as the National Runaway Safe Line, in order to provide information on the resources available. Next slide, please. Within your strategy, youth engagement and collaboration, you must be engaging youth, again, with lived experience to help locate other youth and design individualized approaches to meet youth's needs. This includes youth with lived experience, which ensures that your education and awareness strategies are grounded in youth voices and collaboration. Gateway services must also be a part of your strategy. These are provided when the youth's basic needs need to be met, and they include food, drink, clothing, personal safety information, for example, national youth hotlines and local hotlines. It also includes transportation, hygiene products to prevent malnutrition and ill health, and to ensure they are successful in your program. You must also have the ability to identify youth who are at risk or are victims of trafficking or commercial sex exploitation, sexual abuse, and other forms of victimization, and provide information to those youth, such as the National Suicide Hotline, National Runaway Safe Line, National Human Trafficking Hotline, and National Domestic Violence Hotline. Next slide. Screening and assessment. Your programs must have a standard way to determine a youth's eligibility to receive shelter and services, as well as to identify their needs to make sure services are most appropriate. Your screening and assessment tool should evaluate at a minimum the following: a youth's physical health, the potential for victimization, their behavioral health, their connection to family, their safety, access to resources, issues of neglect or abuse, and other risk and protective factors that impact their well-being and potential for sustainable living. If your program offers optional street-based services, your screening and assessment process must start when you engage a young person on the street, and this is during intake or at the drop-in center. Next slide. Case management. Your programs must provide youth in your program with the following case management services: individualized service or treatment plans. You must plan for services or strategies based on both your screening and assessment tools, as well as the input from youth receiving services. You must have harm reduction services within as a part of your case management, where you are discussing safety planning with youth to reduce the risk of exploitation, human trafficking, sexual assault, substance abuse and misuse, and any other harm associated with street life. You must have a service coordination plan, which includes appropriate and accessible service referral strategies, which are based on the results of the screening and assessments completed at program entry. These services should be coordinated with entities, including but not limited to social services, law enforcement, educational services, vocational and employment training services, welfare department services. Next slide, please. Legal services, organizations that provide support or services to those who have experienced trafficking or are at risk of experiencing trafficking, mental and behavioral health care providers, health care programs, including health insurance options, and affordable child care and child education programs. Within your case management component of your program, you should also include education service plans, and this is where you coordinate with McKinney-Vento School District Liaisons, which are designated under Section 722 G1J II of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. This ensures youth are provided information about educational services that are available to them. Next slide. Aftercare. Your programs must continue to provide services to youth for 3 months after that youth has left your shelter. Your program should develop an aftercare strategy within 3 days of beginning shelter and services. You must also implement a strategy that includes a plan for permanent placement and input from the youth about the support and services they need to achieve their personal goals. Next slide. Optional services. So if your program decides to provide optional services, just remember, this is a part of your funded program. They must be in addition to the basic program requirements. And these services can include street-based services, home-based services, drug abuse education and prevention services, and testing for sexually transmitted diseases. Next slide. Performance standards. So as a condition of your funding, you are required to collect data which demonstrate your ability to meet program performance standards. Your program should improve the outcomes for youth in the following areas: social and emotional well-being, In this area, youth will connect to trauma-informed providers to assist with any issues they face relating to their physical health, substance abuse, mental health, personal safety, and sexual risk behaviors. Under permanent connections, the youth should experience positive outgoing attachments to their families, communities, schools, and other social workers. Under education or employment, youth will connect to school or vocational training programs, improve their job search skills, or obtain employment. And lastly, under safe and stable housing, after leaving your program, the youth will transition to safe and stable housing that appropriately matches their level of need. Options for housing may include moving in with family or other permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, residential treatment centers, or substance abuse treatment centers. Your programs are to report performance data through the Runaway Homeless Youth Homeless Management Information System. To access RHIMUS, your program should work with the local CLC Homeless Management Information System lead. Next slide, please. Another component of the program description is training and technical assistance. If you accept an award, you must comply with the following. You must agree to work cooperatively with the technical assistant provider. Training and technical assistance is free from the Runaway and Homeless Youth Training, Technical Assistance and Capacity Building Center, also known as RITAC. And services include, but are not limited to, regionally based technical assistance clinics, training sessions, e-learning, webinars, and national grantee trainings. You are also required to send at least one person to the annual in-person RHY National Grantee Training and Regional Trainings, and you will participate in learning collaboratives and cohort-based peer engagement activities. Next slide, please. So project narrative, how will you implement your program? Next slide. Your application should include a table of content, which guides the reader through the contents of both files that are uploaded. It should also have a project summary, which is a one-page summary of the project description, and it should include your project narrative, which is where you address all of the proposed activities. Next slide. Project narrative includes, but is not limited to, the following sections: geographic location, need for assistance, approach, organizational capacity, project performance evaluation plan, logic model, project sustainability plan, and a line item budget and budget narrative. Next slide. Under need for assistance, the expectation is that you will identify the problems you plan to solve. These problems could be physical, economic, social, financial, institutional, etc. And to do so, you must demonstrate that there is a need, which includes the nature and scope of the problem. You may provide supporting documentation such as letters of support, testimonials, and list that information in the application appendix. You must also include any relevant data based on planning studies or needs assessments. You may refer to them in the endnotes or footnotes. You can also use demographic data and participant or beneficiary information where you can. Next slide, please. So approach is pretty lengthy, but in this section, you must describe how you will meet all of the project requirements. Your description should include information about the scope and detail of how you will accomplish your proposed project, making certain that you account for all of the functions or activities you identify in your application. You should also You should also explain any potential obstacles as well as the strategies that you will use to address them. Next slide. You must explain your shelter model that you will use, and in your description, you must include the number of youth under the age of 18 that your project will serve in a single structure or within a single floor of a structure in the case of apartment buildings for not more than 21 days with FISB funding. If you shelter youth 18 and over in the same facility as youth 17 and under, you must describe how you will provide and maintain separate sleeping rooms. You must also provide a detailed plan for ensuring the safety and security of minors for use of bathrooms and showers, shelter programming, and recreational activities. You must provide proof that all operating shelters, including host family home models and any shelters you regularly refer clients to, have evidence of their current licensure in the states or localities with licensure requirements. Next slide. You must ensure that project funding is not used for providing respite care, that your facility has 24-hour accessibility 7 days a week with minimal barriers to entry, as well as publicly available shelter telephone numbers that are answered by staff on a 24-hour-a-day basis. You must also ensure that transportation to the shelter is available and easily accessible for youth. And you must ensure that contact is made with parents, legal guardians, or other relatives for each youth as soon as feasible or when safe to do so, but not later than 72 hours after the youth has entered your program. Next slide. If applicable, you must also create an MOU between your program and child welfare if your project is serving any youth who has run away from foster care or child welfare. You must also describe any optional services you plan to support or tell us that you will not support optional services. You must ensure staff are prepared and trained to interact with youth who have run away, are homeless, are living on the streets, or are in crisis, as well as youth experiencing or at risk of experiencing human trafficking. You should tell us about your partners, including partnerships with COCs who also support youth, and if you coordinate with those partners to ensure youth have access to all the community's resources. Next slide. Under the comprehensive youth-centered service model, you must explain how your project will use a youth-centered service model, and the description must include, at a minimum, how you will use a trauma-informed approach when providing these services, and how you will utilize the positive youth development framework to consult and engage with youth with lived experience in your program implementation and provide them with opportunities. Next slide. In ensuring equity, you must explain how your project and organization will ensure equity for diverse populations of young people you will serve. The descriptions must include how your program will work to provide safe, inclusive, and culturally responsive spaces and services and address disparities faced by youth in your community because of their ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability status. You must address how you will support language access needs for all youth and families to be served in your program, how your staffing practices will ensure diversity of staff and leadership that reflect background and or experiences of the youth or organizations you serve, and staff development and training practices which ensure staff and leadership are prepared to implement culturally responsive and specific services. Next slide. Gateway services. In your application, you must explain how your project will meet youth's basic needs, and the explanation must include how you will provide youth with food, drink, clothing, transportation, personal safety information such as national youth hotlines and local hotlines, resource guides, and hygiene products. It must also include how you will identify youth who are at risk of or who are victims of trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and other forms of victimization, and provide those youth with resources such as national hotline numbers. Next slide. Your project should address screening and assessment, and this is where you will need to explain how your project will determine a youth's eligibility for services through a screening and assessment tool. Your tool should evaluate at a minimum the suitability for the program, physical and behavioral health, safety, potential victimization, connection to family, access to resources, neglect or abuse, and identification, assistance, and referral for delivery of appropriate services. Next slide. Harm reduction and case management. Under harm reduction, you must describe your program's approach to harm reduction and explain how your program will educate youth about safety plans and identifying ways to reduce risk of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, sexual assault, substance use and misuse, and any other harm associated with street life. Under case management, you must explain how your program will provide case management services, and this should include a description of how your program will work with you to plan for individualized services and treatment strategies, how your project's referral strategy is implemented to ensure that appropriate system of care services are accessible. It should also include a description of your project's educational strategies for ensuring coordination with McKinney-Vento School District liaisons and for the provision of educational services that are available to youth. Next slide. In your project narrative, when you are addressing aftercare, you must explain how your project will prepare youth for transitioning from your project and how you will provide aftercare services for a period of 3 months after project exit. This description must include how your project will develop a written transition plan with each youth that meets their needs and supports safe and stable living, how your project will ensure youth have access to important documents and paperwork as needed, such as birth certificates, social security cards, driver's license or state identification cards, medical records, and credit reports. It should also explain how your project will conduct aftercare services for each youth who exits your program for at least 3 months. Next slide. Your proposal should also address how your project will develop an aftercare strategy that outlines how you will maintain contact to ensure each youth's ongoing safety and documents the following: services, referrals, and counseling offered related to healthcare and insurance coverage, youth housing status, educational services, and rates of participation in and completion of the services, evidence of regular contact, including all attempts to contact for a period of 3 months, and how, if applicable, services beyond those 3 months will be documented. Assistance in obtaining appropriate educational, vocational, training, or employment services, including those coordinated with McKinney-Vento School District liaisons designated under the McKinney-Vento Act. You provide or describe your supportive services to assist in job advancement or post-secondary education and training, and will support in improving social and emotional well-being and permanent connections. Next slide. If your program opts to propose or provide optional services, remember that these services are in addition to the basic program requirements, and they include street-based services, home-based services, drug abuse education and prevention services, and testing for sexually transmitted diseases. If you provide these services, you must have criteria which determine eligibility for the services and detail what services you will be providing, where, by whom, and for how long. Your project must also use evidence-based or evidence-informed models, curricula, and practices. Next slide. Performance standards. When addressing performance standards, you must explain how your project will collect data and use program performance standards as measures of successful outcomes for youth. Projects are responsible for enhancing in the 4 core outcome areas, which include social and emotional well-being, permanent connections, education or employment, and safe and stable housing. Under training, you will provide a description of your plan to send at least 1 key staff person to attend the annual National RHY grantee training, annual regional trainings, and any other required training or technical assistance sponsored by the Division of Runaway and Homeless Youth. Next slide. Under organizational capacity, your program should provide the following information for your full project team, including the applicant organizations and any cooperating partners, contractors and subrecipients. Provide evidence that your team has the relevant experience and expertise needed to carry out the project. Describe your team's experience with administering, developing, implementing, managing, and evaluating similar projects. Provide evidence that your team has the organizational capability to fulfill their roles and functions effectively. Next slide. You should also describe your experience working collaboratively with youth and young adults with lived experience of homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness or housing instability to inform program design, implementation, and improvement. If you are not a member of a COC, which is a continuum of care, you must explain your plan to contact and work with a COC HMIS lead for data collection and reporting purposes. Additionally, you will explain which COC you will partner with for RIMA's data collection. If your program provides services in more than one COC, explain how you will coordinate data collection and reporting among the multiple COCs. Next slide. Under Project Performance Evaluation Plan, you will describe how you will monitor ongoing activities and the progress towards the project's goals and objectives. You will address the inputs, key activities, and expected outcomes of the funded activities. Inputs might include your collaborative partners, key staff, budget, service processes, or other resources. You will also address how you will measure the inputs, activities, and outcomes, how you will use the resulting information to inform improvement of funded activities, and any processes that support the overall data quality. Next slide. You will address the organizational systems and processes that will track performance outcomes, how your organization will collect and manage data in a way that allows for accurate and timely reporting of performance outcomes. You will address any potential obstacles to implement the program project performance evaluation and how you will address them. You will also provide a timeline for how you will review information from the performance evaluation and apply it to your ongoing project. Next slide. Logic model. So a logic model is a diagram that describes how inputs drive activities to produce outputs, outcomes, and the goals of the proposed project. The logic model will include inputs such as resources, organizational profile, collaborative partners, key staff, budget. It will also include your target population, which identifies what individuals will be served or their identified needs. It lists activities, mechanisms, and processes, which include evidence-based practices, best practices, approach, key intervention and evaluation component, and continuous quality improvement efforts. Your model will describe your outputs, which are immediate and direct results of your program activities, your outcomes, which are expected short and long-term results of the project you expect to achieve, and your project goals, which are the overarching objectives and reasons for proposing the project. In essence, the logic model is a description of how the activities, inputs, and outputs will link to outcomes associated with preventing youth from experiencing homelessness. Next slide. Project sustainability. When addressing the project sustainability, your program should provide an approach to project sustainability that is effective and feasible and describes the following. The key personnel and organizations whose support you will require, the types of alternative support you will require to maintain the project, and if the proposed project involves key project partners, how you will maintain their cooperation or collaboration after federal funding ends. Next slide. Line item budget and budget narrative. As you developed your budget, please consider if the costs are necessary, reasonable, allocable, and consistent with your project's purpose and activities. Please also consider how you calculate your cost in ways that are clear and repeatable, and how funds are restricted. And within the NOFO, you should see the funding policies and limitations. Be reminded that you must include the cost of sending at least one person to attend the annual in-person RHY National Grantee Training, in-person regional training, and up to 2 collaboration events. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the merit review, and this is essentially how your application will be evaluated. Next slide. Panel reviewers will assess why you need assistance. If you have described the problem of youth homelessness in your community, they will also look at who will receive services. Have you described the demographic information about the target population and sub-criteria of how many youth you expect to serve? Next slide. Under safe, stable, and appropriate shelter, have you explained the proposed shelter model and the counseling services you will provide? Have you described your shelter, its license, and how its physical structure is consistent with the requirements described in the program description? Under comprehensive youth-centered service model, have you addressed how you will effectively integrate PYD and trauma-informed care into your program? Under outreach implementation strategy, have you described your outreach implementation strategy, including outreach, education and awareness, youth engagement and coordination, and the provision of gateway services? Next slide. Under screening and assessment, how will your program screening and assessment process determine eligibility for shelter and services? Have you described the screening tools you will use, the planned assessment process, and how information from the assessment will inform service delivery, including identifying youth victims of trafficking? Under case management, have you explained how harm reduction or how you do a harm reduction in case management services, including treatment, service coordination, and education services plan. Aftercare. Do you describe how you provide aftercare service to youth receiving shelter services? Next slide. Under organizational capacity and third-party agreements, what experience and expertise do you have managing a runaway and homeless youth program? Do you describe your past work, program design, experience working collaboratively with youth and young adults with lived experience, and your ability to connect young people at risk of or experiencing homelessness to appropriate services? Have you described your plan to ensure data accuracy and the timely upload of all appropriate data into RIMAS? If you will make a subaward of a contract with another organization to carry out project, or will you? If so, how will you ensure they complete their work and contribute to the success of the project? If you will not make a subaward or have an agreement with a third party, state specifically in your application that you will not. Next slide. Under performance, evaluation plan, and logic model, have you described how you will evaluate your program, including how you will use RIMAS to assist you in defining success and how you will use RIMAS data to improve the program's performance? What challenges do you expect to face in implementing the project? Have you described how you will how your proposed activities, inputs, and outputs link to the outcomes you will achieve in preventing youth and young adults from experiencing homelessness? Next slide. Under budget, did you provide a clear line item budget and narrative budget for the federal amount and non-federal amount in your application? Does your budget and budget narrative clearly explain how the funds and that are requested are necessary for the program? And did you include the cost of sending a staff person to attend the required training and meetings? How much will it cost your organization to run the project? How much additional money in addition to the federal funds from this award is required? And what is the source of those funds? Have you addressed how you will ensure proper oversight of federal funds and funded activities? And if you propose sub-awards, have you explained how you will ensure that the sub-award recipients will complete their work and contribute to the success of the project? If there are no proposed sub-awards and you do not have any agreements with third parties, you should also state specifically that these agreements do not exist. Next slide. Under sustainability plan, how will your project be sustainable? What other sources of funding will you look for if the federal funds are not available? And how will you retain staff and maintain partnerships if the program loses funding? Next slide. In addressing ensuring equity, how will you promote equity in youth service delivery and recruitment? And how will your equity plan impact the organization and community? Next slide. Other important items to include reporting, administrative, and national policy requirements and key definitions. Next slide, please. If selected for funding, there are important rules that you will need to follow if you get this award. Many are detailed on page 41 of the NOFO. However, a comprehensive list can be found on the Family and Youth Services Bureau website, which covers the following topics: HHS grants policy statement, equal treatment of faith-based organizations, RIDE program administrative requirements, and they include staff safety, background checks, emergency preparedness plan, licensing requirements, training plan, serving youth who run away from foster care or correctional institutions, technical assistance, monitoring, and short-term training confidentiality. You are required to adhere to these requirements as a condition of receiving the award, But please remember that failure to do so could result in the loss of funding. Next slide. If you are successful, again, you have to submit financial and performance reports. To learn more about this, please see reporting at the ACF website, which is listed in the back of the NOFO. If selected for funding, recipients must submit a variety of programmatic and financial reports after receiving a grant award. Accurate and timely submission of these reports are important to each recipient's success and continued funding. You will report performance data through RIMUS, and to access RIMUS, you will work with your local COC, Homeless Management Information System lead. Next slide. At the back of the NOFO, there are some key NOFO-related definitions that are in the back of the NOFO, and there's a hyperlink that you can access. Next slide, please. So now we have arrived to the submitted questions that were posed in advance of today's webinar. I will state the question and the response. Question. Next slide, please. Question. The NOFO states that priority will be given to applicants who request grants of less than $200,000. In determining this, will you look just at the federal share of the project cost, or will you look at the total project cost, including both the federal share and the required match? Response. Priority for applicants requesting less than $200,000 is based on the federal amount requested and does not include the cost sharing amount. Next slide. Question. Please provide clarification regarding the limitation of funding policies on page 17 related to the provision or referral to treatment that aims to change someone's sexual orientation. The question is directed at ensuring that this does not prohibit gender-affirming activities, groups, and supports for LGBTQIA+ youth, especially transgender youth, but is rather directed at prohibiting treatment that would cure someone of being LGBTQ2IA+. This is on page 17 of the NOFO. Response. Pursuant to RHY Regulation 45 CFR Part 1351.16, Subpart B, a runaway and homeless youth program grant does not cover any treatment or referral to treatment that aims to change someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Next slide. Question. Please clarify the allowable level of subawards that can be provided. The link provided on page 18 of the NOFO states that a justification must be provided for subawards of greater than 50% of the award, while the guidance on page 35 states that the amount of the subaward cannot be more than 50% of the total direct cost. See below for cut and paste from website link provided and notice of funding opportunity under application resources. Response. A subaward to any one organization cannot be more than 50% of the total direct cost. An applicant may exceed subawards of more than 50% of the total direct cost if making subawards to multiple organizations. A justification for subawarding a portion of the project costs must be included along with a detailed budget and budget narrative for each of the subawards. Next slide. On page 36, question on page 36, under organizational capacity, supporting documentation, what type of information / documents could be submitted to demonstrate information on compliance with federal, state, and local government standards? Response. If there are state, federal, local standards / requirements associated with the program, they should be included. Next slide. Question. In the NOFO, under the application contents and format section, project narrative, the instructions state, use the headings and order of the sections that follow. However, the headings and order that follow are not numbered and do not consistently match the criteria headings. For example, the NOFO places ensuring equity in a different position than the criteria. In the SOP proposal, ensuring equity is placed early on between comprehensive youth-centered services model and outreach implementation strategy, while in the criteria section, it is numbered 7.1 and is the last section of the narrative. As we have in prior years, we would like to order our response to follow the more logical ordering of the criteria. Is this permitted, or must we adhere to the headings and order of the sections as set forth in the application contents and format section? Response: please review step 3. Prepare your application for information and directions about how to format your application and what information you should include. Next slide. Question: please confirm that documentation of the source of the cost share is no longer a required attachment. In the past, we were required to attach a letter from the source confirming the match amount. Response: for any cost sharing, including a detailed listing of any funding sources identified in Block 18 of the SF 424 application for federal assistance. Next slide, please. Question: will biographical sketches and/or streamlined job descriptions satisfy the resume and job description requirements? The addition of job descriptions for all key staff, not just vacant positions as in the past, could significantly lengthen file 2, which in turn would force a comparable shortening of the file 1's narrative content. Response: your application must include resumes or CVs for all key personnel, as well as job descriptions for each key position, filled and vacant. Next slide. Question: with respect to staff training, the requirement in prior years asked applicants to describe how staff are trained on a long list of training topics. This is no longer included. Can you confirm that we don't have to describe staff training beyond participation in RITAC's conference and regional and other trainings? Response: please review step 6. Learn what happens after award, administrative and national policy requirements for more detailed information about expectation if you receive an award. The administrative requirements information does include a detailed list of training programs must consider offering their staff. Next slide. So we have reached the end of the pre-application webinar. I would like to thank you all again for attending, and I hope that the webinar provided some insight and additional clarity around the Basic Center program, NOFO. Please be reminded that this webinar, this recorded webinar, will be available on the RITAC site, and that is ritac.net. Again, thank you for your attention and participation.